Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is not the first time I've given this talk to the U3A, but mostly at the history group. So today, this is for the whole U3A in Javea. So thank you very much for the invitation. And off we go. So we're going to be talking about the Franco years, the restoration of the monarchy, and covering the period 1939 to the present day. So what's happening here? This is continue, that's right. So the first date I have to give you is the 1st of April 1939, because it was on this day that the Civil War finished. And Franco and his what became known as the nationalist side of the war, they achieved victory, and the government, the Republican side, were defeated. Then subsequently, there was a grand parade down the Gran Via in Madrid, and this is a photograph of it. And this was not only Spanish troops, but it also included Italians, because Mussolini had sent something like 70,000 soldiers to fight in the Civil War, and also the Germans. The Nazis had sent a group called the Condor Legion, which consisted mainly of aircraft and armored warfare, armored tanks and so forth, artillery, and this all went down the parade in the Gran Via. And it's quite interesting when you think about it that they all then departed Spain and went back to Italy or to Germany. Of course, in the case of Germany, they'd learned a lot of, refined their military techniques, the blitzkrieg, coordination of aircraft and tanks and so forth, which was very successful, of course, subsequently in Poland and France and Russia. But they left and left Spain to its own devices. Interestingly, perhaps, that they didn't ask for any bases. If they'd have had bases, no doubt Franco would have given them bases, and this might have had an influence in the Second World War. But of course, they didn't have any bases. They left and went back to Germany, because in fact the Italians had more or less taken over Majorca. They used the airport. Their navy was in the Palma Bay. Submarines were El Soler, and their float planes were up at Arcadia. So this was a big center of Italian military during the war, but they left and went home. Anyway, this is the Grand Parade. And of course, the leader of the nationalist side was Franco, El Caudillo, the leader. And however, he was lucky in a way to be leader. You often find when you study the lives of some of these famous people that they had a bit of luck. They may say they made their own luck, but he did have luck, because Sojourner, who was a senior general during the colonial war in Morocco, he was killed in an air crash in 1936. He would normally have been leader of the coup. Mola, who was another general, he was killed in an air crash in 1937. And there two of them are, Mola and Franco. And then also Jose Antonio Primo, who was a charismatic politician who founded the Falange. He was arrested before the beginning of the war, and in fact were finished up in the prison in the castle in Alicante, where he was shot in 1936. And it's interesting to think that he might well have been exchanged, because there were a lot of people caught on the wrong side of the war, of the front lines in the Civil War, and he could have been secreted out. But Franco made no attempt to help him escape. And so, as I say, he was shot by the Republicans in 1936. And finally, perhaps they had this meeting in 1936 to decide who was going to be leading the coup. And they had this meeting in Salamanca in October 36. And Franco's elder brother, Nicholas, he wrote the minutes. And in the minutes, they thought they'd agreed that Franco was going to be head of the government, but in the minutes it said he was going to be head of state. And of course, he remained head of state for the next 39 years. So whereas if he'd been head of the government, they might have changed the government. So this is another thing that led to his success and his dictatorship. And this is a picture of Jose Antonio, who was also actually buried in the Valle de Caídos alongside Franco. I'll talk about this a little bit later on. Whether his body is still there now or not, I don't know, because Franco's body's been moved, of course, fairly recently. And this is a picture of the Phalange, which was founded in 1934, the blue shirts and the yoke on the flag. And the Phalange, actually, Franco took over the Phalange and he really ran Spain through the Phalange for most of his dictatorship. So his policy, one church, Spain is nothing if she is not Catholic. One party, the Phalange, no unions or political parties. Any individual associated with the left was imprisoned, sent to a labor camp or executed. One state, no devolution. They weren't going to allow Catalan any sort of independence, Catalonia, and one language. You couldn't speak Valenciano in the streets or Catalan. You might get arrested. And one leader, no doubt who that was. So moving on to 1940, after the fall of France, there was a meeting between Franco and Hitler in October at this place called Hendaye, which is just near Biarritz on the Riba, just on the border there between France and Spain. And this is a picture of the meeting. Franco was 3 hours late. It wasn't clear really whether this was because of the hopeless state of the Spanish railway system or whether it was deliberate. Anyway, the Führer didn't like hanging around. He was pretty wound up about the whole thing. But once they met, they didn't get on. And it's surprising in a way because Franco had a big debt to Hitler in terms of all the help he got during the war. So you think it might be payback time, but no, they didn't get on. Hitler said meeting Franco was like going to the dentist. So Franco, when he met Hitler, he wanted a colony. He wanted all of Morocco, not just the little bit Spain had got at the top, but he also needed food, fuel, and armaments. But Hitler would like Gibraltar. Hitler didn't want, however, he didn't want another lame duck. He'd already got Mussolini and Italy. And also, he didn't want to upset Pétain, who at this time was head of Vichy France, which controlled a lot of the Spanish Empire in Africa and other places. So he was quite happy with that situation and didn't want to upset him. So they didn't come to any agreement. The Spanish colonies that did exist at this time in Africa was a little bit at the top of Morocco, Spanish Morocco, Western Sahara there, which of course has been in the news lately. Might say something about that a bit later on. And then this tiny little country called Equatorial Guinea down at the bottom there, which subsequently became independent and in fact has quite a lot of oil. So it's quite a wealthy country. It's run by a dictator. You may recall there was an attempted coup against Mugabe many years ago, and they were going to fly into Equatorial Guinea after they'd overthrown Mugabe, but that never happened, that never went through. So that's Equatorial Guinea. Those are the three colonies that Franco had, and of course he wanted the rest of Morocco, which Hitler did not agree to. Subsequently, he had a visit from Himmler. There's Himmler on Franco's right, there on the left, in the middle of the picture. And Franco suggested that all these prisoners that Franco had got, he should put them to work to repair Spain and improve the situation. So that's indeed what Franco did. And he also employed a lot of them in building his memorial at the Valle de Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. He had a visit to Italy. There's Mussolini on the right, and his brother-in-law is on the left. That is, he was both Home Home Secretary, the equivalent Ministry of the Interior, and also he was Foreign Secretary at the time. But very shortly after this visit in 1941, he was dismissed, and he developed a career as an international lawyer, because Franco, whoever you were, he didn't want anybody to get too powerful to be able to challenge him. So nobody was kept in post very, very long. They were all moved on, and he brought in other people. So he was the wily Galician. He made sure that nobody would be in a position to challenge his leadership. This is a very difficult time for Spain, for the ordinary people. The years of hunger, if you ever speak to anybody who lived through this period, they say we were always hungry. And particularly in the areas of Valencia and Catalonia, because of course they were on the wrong side of the war. And so they really suffered and had a very, very difficult time. In fact, a lot of people who you may meet who lived through that time, they're fairly short in stature because they got such a bad nutrition that they didn't grow to the average height of people. They're perhaps just achieving 5 foot. There aren't that many of them left now, of course, because the time has resulted in them dying, but you could always pick them out because they were so short in stature. There were shortages of food and fuel. And the loss of the gold reserves, this happened because during the Civil War, the Republican government sent all the gold reserves to the Soviet Union. They shipped them out of Cartagena, and they went into the Soviet Union for Uncle Joe Stalin to look after. And of course, after the war, Franco said, could we have our gold back? And Stalin said, no, this is reparations for all the help I gave to the Republican government during the war. So he never got his gold back. And of course, this made life even more difficult from a trading point of view for Spain during this period. The economic policy, therefore, was autarky, which means just trying to improve the situation from your own reserves. There was not much opportunity for trade and bringing in overseas investment. This led to widespread corruption, and everything was controlled by the Falange. Wages were very low and costs had escalated. So terrible time. Any strikes, brutally suppressed. There's a lot of begging, pilfering, and prostitution. And agriculture was backward, transport and low productivity, backward transport and low productivity. Electricity, telephones, and water supply were sporadic. The so-called reconstruction during this period, there was a rigid state control. All interest was subordinated to the nation. Syndicates of employers and workers were created where market share and resources allocated, sort of planned economy. Bank finance was subject to political and economic control. Economic sectors considered to be of strategic importance were subject to control. Licenses, very scarce. Foreign currency, difficult. Economic decisions entrusted to a coterie of military officers who tried to run the country like a military barracks. The system was very inefficient and led to black markets, corruption, and insider dealing. And the turnover over this period, the GDP, you can see very modest increase compared with Western Europe over the same period. Now, this is an interesting lady because in addition, the Falange had a section for the ladies, the female section, Falange Session Femenina. And she was a brother of Jose Antonio, who I mentioned earlier, who was shot in Alicante in 1936. And this was the policy of the Session Femenina, traditional Catholic values for women, rearing children and providing a good home for their landlords. This gets better. Dressed modestly, obedience and subservience, social work by unmarried mothers, unmarried members, and quote, man is a torrent of egoism, women must accept a life of submission, service, and abnegation. The man is the king, the wife and the children just the necessary complements, so that man may reach his plenitude. She never married, but there was an idea, that suggestion that she might marry Hitler. What a result that might have been. But so approaches were made to the German embassy, and the message came back that wasn't a very good idea, because she wouldn't be able to have any children because Hitler was impotent, which suggests that barrack room song that we all used to have about the Colonel Bogey about Hitler, maybe there was some truth in it. So there we go. There she was. That was her. Now, one of the countries that did help Spain during this period was Argentina. They helped with wheat and with meat. And of course, it was run by a dictatorship, by Peron, and so that worked quite well, two dictators together, I suppose, from the trading point of view. And Eva Peron, here on the left, she did a European tour in 1946, and there she is meeting Franco, and that's Franco's wife, Carmen, looking on. It was a sort of competition of hats in a way, but nothing came of this visit, but it's quite an interesting occasion to record. Now on back to the royal family. Now, Alfonso XIII and his queen, Victoria Eugenia, they abdicated, or he abdicated in 1931, and that established the Second Republic, the onset of the Second Republic. He was estranged from his wife by this time, as often seems to happen in royal families, especially the Spanish royal family, but he really felt his wife responsible for introducing haemophilia into the Spanish royal family, because she was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and Queen Victoria was also a carrier of haemophilia. So they had 3 sons, and the youngest one, Don Juan, he married Maria de la Mercedes Bourbon-Orléans in 1935. And there were, in fact, 2 elder sons, Don Alfonso and Don Jaime, but both abdicated their claim to the throne, and they renounced the monarchy. But there's one important person you notice there, that Alfonso, the son of Don Jaime, he comes into the story a bit later, so just remember that's where he comes from. And this is Don Juan on the right, the youngest son, and they had initially 3 children. They had actually 4. They had another daughter, but Pilar was the eldest, and then Juan Carlos, born in January 38, and Alfonso in October 41. And in 1947, Franco met Don Juan, who by this time, he and his family were living in Estoril, or just outside Lisbon in Portugal. And Franco wanted to establish succession. Now, he didn't want to establish a Franco dynasty, surprisingly. He obviously had some feeling for the monarchy and felt they stood for something worthwhile in Spain. And he wanted to see if he could bring the Spanish monarchy back into Spain on his death. And he met Don Juan. Now, Don Juan was a Democrat. He wanted to establish a constitutional monarchy, and that wasn't Franco's idea. Franco wanted his movimiento to be maintained. So it was agreed at this meeting that there would be a law of succession to the Spanish monarchy, and the successor had to be Spanish born, he had to be Catholic, he had to be over 30, he had to be loyal to the movimiento, the phalange, and this resulted in Juan Carlos, who was Don Juan's oldest son. He would succeed on the death of Franco, but Franco would oversee his education in Spain, culminating in his graduation from the military academy at Zaragoza. And here's a picture of the family at this time, November 48. And you can see Don Juan in the back there and his younger brother Alfonso sitting on his father's lap. Now, at this time in Estoril, these two boys would play and they had guns and they would, you know, bang you're dead, that sort of thing, that all youngsters used to in those days. I don't know whether they do anymore. They seem to play Lego now, but in those days we all had guns and played cowboys and Indians and that sort of thing. And in fact, Juan Carlos shot and killed his brother Alfonso. And it appeared there that one of the guns that they thought they were playing was actually loaded. And he killed his brother. The whole thing was hushed up at the time. And it was suggested to me when I was giving this talk once that actually they were given a loaded revolver by one of Franco's agents so that one of them would be killed because they didn't want a rival to whoever Franco selected as a successor to be around. So it was a way of eliminating a rival. So the wily Galician maybe was behind this death of Alfonso. We'll never know. So the Franco family, Maria de Carmen was his wife, and they had one daughter who was also Maria del Carmen, and she married in 1950 Cristobal Bordu. Now, he subsequently became the Marquez de Villaverde. And Franco didn't like his son-in-law or their family. He thought they were corrupt. They had a monopoly for the importation of Italian scooters, which were obviously quite the rage at this time. And he didn't like them. And so he wasn't keen on the idea of any succession coming from his daughter's marriage or her family, because she did what all members of the Session Femenina should have done. She had 7 children. So there were plenty of opportunities for a succession there, but Franco didn't want any of them. Here's Franco on a state visit with his wife. He was on a state visit to Salazar, who was dictator of Portugal. That was the only country really which they had diplomatic relations with in the 1940s, because the EU or the Europeans didn't want anything to do with him because he was a fascist dictator. But he had a good PR side to him, and these are some of his myths, his statements, his PR announcements. I am the sentry who is never relieved, the one who receives unwelcome news and dictates solutions, the one who is watchful while others sleep. He was a brilliant diplomat who kept Spain out of World War II. He created social peace, whereas the reality was labor camps, mass exile, prisoners, torture, and executions. However, things began to pick up in Spain in 1949. Because of the Cold War, because obviously Franco was fiercely anti-communist, the Americans decided to set up some bases in Spain, and this was achieved with a loan to Spain, which obviously achieved a lot to improve the economy in Spain at the time. Another interesting development showing the future of Spain, Pedro Zaragoza. He was mayor of Benidorm. Now, at this time, Benidorm was a little fishing village, I believe, and he saw the possibility of developing tourism, because tourists were gradually finding their way into Spain, and of course they tended to strip off on the beach, and that didn't match the rules of the Session Femenina, and the Guardia went in to try and arrest these people, and scuffled with scantily dressed girls on the beach. And Zaragoza was threatened with excommunication. What a fate in 1953 as allowing all this sort of behavior to go on the beaches in Benidorm. So he got on his scooter and he went to Spain, he went to Madrid and visited Franco and persuaded him to allow the wearing of bikinis in Benidorm. And here's a picture of him. He died in 2008. So he really started the tourism economy, the tourism industry that we have in Spain now. Here's some pictures of Benidorm, quite a nice place if you go off season, I think. Anyway, the next person to come who was significant was Eisenhower. He came in 55 and he agreed to continue US loans. They're the two generals together. And so that carried on and that continued to improve the economy in Spain. Spanish Morocco in 1955 was given independence because France withdrew from Morocco, and a modern state of Morocco was created, where incorporating both French and Spanish Morocco. But of course, Spain retained the enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, which of course have been in the news. Well, Ceuta has anyway, which is just opposite Gibraltar there in the North Africa. And this has been in the news lately with illegal immigrants, hasn't it? But that little colony was incorporated in Morocco, modern Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla. Now, as all dictators tend to do, a lot of them, like kings and queens, they like to leave a large monument to their life. And in Franco's case, he wanted to build this mausoleum, the Valle de la Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. Some of you may have been there. It's always worth going to have a look if you have the chance. This huge cross, which can be seen a long way away, almost from Madrid, and the mausoleum underneath. And this was built with slave labor in the 1940s and 50s, and a lot died building it. This is the mausoleum where you go in, and Franco's grave was right at the end there. Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera was also buried there as well. Certainly when I was there, they were there. And that's over the area where the graves were. So I think the government now decided that it should be a monument to all who died in the Civil War, not just the nationalists and the fascists. It was inaugurated, say, in 1959. Jose Antonio was reinterred there, and he died in Alicante. Then in 1955, the king, Juan Carlos, he qualified from Zaragoza Academy, and there he is being marched out, passing out parade. And you notice the priest on his right there, the left-hand side of the picture. The priests, the Catholic Church, were everywhere during the Franco period, and there's the priest overlooking the passing out parade from the military academy. And now there was a change also politically at this time, a takeover of Opus Dei technocrats to run the state. This was a movement created in the 1920s, and their policy, holiness is achieved by hard work, austerity, celibacy, and devotion to professional excellence. And they produced a development plan which weakened the control of the phalange. And here are two of their technocrats, all dressed up in their morning suits to still see Franco, or everything very formal. The economy obviously picked up. There were more TV sets, you can see there, and car production increased markedly during the latter periods of Franco's life. And the economy again picked up. You see, from 1950 to 73, it increased 3 or 4 times. So things did get a lot better towards the end of the period. In 1962, Juan Carlos married Princess Sofia. Now, she was a member of the Greek royal family, and she was brought up as an Orthodox Christian. So the initial wedding was in Greece to the Orthodox rite, and then in a few days later, she comes over to Madrid and gets married again in the Catholic rite. In the meantime, she's converted to Catholicism. So that sorted out the issue that she wasn't Catholic, which wouldn't have suited Franco. Anyway, they married, of course, and they've had 3 children, two girls and a son, one of whom is now, of course, King Philip VI. So that's their wedding. Franco, in the meantime, was leading the life of a country gentleman. He would go out shooting, and they made sure that deers appeared at the right place, and he had a chance to shoot them. And then he obviously spent time on his horse, and also on his yacht, where he spent a lot of time fishing. And he also did a painting, and this was in one of the Telegraph magazines years ago. And I thought some of these pictures actually look quite good to me. Anyway, he was becoming an artist. And here he is with his family. He had, as I said, seven grandchildren. There's his wife on his left, and then the children round him. So in 1969, it's formally announced that Juan Carlos will be Franco's successor. And there they are on a balcony in Madrid somewhere making this announcement. And the Franco family, as I've said, they had 7 children, and one of the children married Alfonso de Bourbon Dampierre, who was the son of the second son of Alfonso XIII and Queen Victoria Eugenia. And they married in 1972. So there was a suggestion that there might be another possibility of the succession down this family. And this is the picture of Alfonso de Bourbon Dampierre. So he comes down, as I said, he was the son of Don Jaime, who was the second son of Alfonso and Victoria. So succession politics. There's Juan Carlos, who was picked by Franco, the government, and the Opus Dei technocrats. Alfonso de Bourbon Dampierre, who obviously was being proposed by Franco's wife and daughter. And then there was Carlos, who was of the Carlist line. Now, this goes back a long way in Spanish history, because this was the time when Ferdinand VII only had a daughter. And when he died in about 1830, his daughter became Isabella II and as queen. But a lot of Spanish people at the time thought it was quite wrong to have a queen on the throne. They wanted a man on the throne, and they had one in the case of Carlos, who was Ferdinand's younger brother. And there was, amazingly, there were 2 civil wars about this in Spain in the 1830s, and eventually the Carlists lost, but they didn't give up. They kept going, and they were involved in the civil war on Franco's side, and then even now they still had their candidate for the throne, so they didn't give up. And then finally there was Don Juan, who was Juan Carlos's father, who would like to have been king, but Franco said, no way, you're too much of a Democrat. Then here's a picture of Franco with Juan Carlos, and Carrero Blanco on the left-hand side. He'd worked with Franco all the way through the war and through his government, stayed very close to him, and he was blown up by an ETA bomb in December 73. So ETA were beginning to get into the picture now of wanting to get rid of the fascists, and also obviously to getting Basque independence as well. Franco's last prime minister was Arias on the left here, there's Franco on the right. And here's the final public appearance in October 75, by which time I think he was about 84. And they tried to keep him alive until 76, because he would then have had 40 years as head of state, but he didn't make it because he died on the 20th of November 75. And in 2 days later, pretty quick, Juan Carlos was proclaimed king in the Cortes. And there's a picture of the proclamation with his wife, Sophia, Queen Sophia, on the left-hand side of the picture. And there's Franco's grave at the time in the mausoleum. Pictures of Juan Carlos in his younger days. And he oversaw the development of a new constitution, which was voted on and in a national referendum. And this established a bicameral Cortes, a Congress of Deputies, a Senate, a fixed 4-year terms, voting on party lists, which you're surely familiar with, and devolution to 17 autonomies and 2 cities. And the autonomous communities, some of them have their own, or they all have their own education, health services, but some also have their own police and control finance. And there's a picture of the autonomies. The languages, there are of course 5 languages in Spain. And in 1977, Suarez became prime minister, and he formed a sort of central party, and Juan Carlos became constitutional monarch. Suarez died fairly recently. He died from Alzheimer's, and apparently he couldn't remember, before his death, he couldn't remember that he'd ever been prime minister. Anyway, his party broke up. Well, before that, he brought in a pact of forgiving and agreed by all political parties. So the atrocities that had been executed on both sides were forgotten. There was an attempted coup in 1981 by Colonel Tejero, and he led an armed attack on the Cortes, which was all filmed on television. And the king came on the television subsequently and said, "We don't do things like this in Spain anymore. We've got a constitution, we have a rule of law," and the coup was overthrown, and Tejero was imprisoned. So that was the end of military coups, which of course had been a history in Spain for generations previously. So González then became PM, and he was a leader of the PSOE, and he led Spain for 14 years. He was a moderate socialist, not extremist like a lot of those in the Republican period before the Civil War. And he got Spain into the EU in '86, and he established the construction of the high-speed trains, and he achieved this by giving Alstom a main contract, which then resulted in France supporting his war against ETA and also supporting Barcelona for the Olympic Games in 1992. You all know about the AVE, and that's the network. They're claiming they're going to have the largest high-speed train system in Europe. Maybe they have now, I don't know. Michael Portillo, I just have to mention him because there was a program he made several years ago now, in which he traveled on the AVE, and he went to Madrid to meet a lot of his uncles. You may recall that his father was a professor of law at Madrid University, and he escaped during the Civil War. Initially, he was in the government in the Republican Army, but he said he wouldn't ever shoot anybody because he might kill one of his brothers, because all his brothers supported Franco. So that the Civil War divided families like this. Anyway, he met his uncles in Madrid, and subsequently he went on to Barcelona and spoke to people in the football ground there, the Nou Camp, and he said that, of course, he was told that in the Franco period, that was one of the few places where the Catalonians could express their nationality and their language and so on. Franco was actually very keen on football, and Barcelona did recruit a very successful footballer from Brazil called Di Stefano, and he didn't last in Barcelona very long because Franco made sure he was transferred to Real Madrid, that was Franco's team. And you may recall, if you look at the statistics, that Real Madrid have actually won the Champions League more than any other club, because at this time they won it every year initially. They haven't won it quite so often lately, of course. He was succeeded, González, back to the Prime Minister by Aznar for 2 terms. There's Aznar. and he was leader of the PP. The PP sort of morphed from the Phalange, really. That was his origin, but of course it's not a fascist party now. And they were involved in the First Gulf War, and this is a meeting in the Azores, actually, with Barroso on the left, who was the Portuguese Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, George W. Bush, and Aznar. Then there was this atrocity in 2004 in the Etosha station, where there were 10 explosions on 4 commuter trains, and 191 people were killed and over 2,000 injured. Terrible thing. Bombs were triggered by mobile foam alarms, and subsequently there was an attempt on an RV train. 2 weeks later, suspected militants were cornered in a flat and they exploded a bomb which killed themselves and a policeman. And that's a picture of one of the devastations on one of the trains. This was just before an election, and the government said it was ETA. But the PSOE, the socialists, said that it was an Al-Qaeda event intending to influence Spanish involvement in the Iraq war. And the PP lost an election as a result of that bombing, which they were expected to win. And Spanish troops were subsequently withdrawn from Iraq. Zapatero then became leader, became prime minister, and he ruled for 2 terms. And just showing the election results, at this time it was still more or less a 2-party race between the socialists, the PSOE and the PP. And this situation, of course, has changed now. That's Zapatero with a lot of his lady ministers. He's equivalent to Blair's babes. You may remember that picture. And there he is with all of them. And of course, they cleverly manipulated their economy, so they still were getting huge grants from the EU, which of course they didn't waste altogether. They did use it to construct the marvelous motorway system that they have, that you have, and the railway system as well. Felipe got married to Leticia in May 2004, and she was a television reporter, and they met in Galicia because there'd been a big oil spill of a tanker offshore, and they met and subsequently married. She actually had been married before, but because it was only a civil marriage, the Catholic Church said, that doesn't matter, we don't count those, so you can have a proper Catholic wedding, which he did, and there's a picture of them on the royal balcony. And they have 2 daughters, and the eldest, Leticia, they've changed the law in Spain now that we can have a queen, or you will have a queen when Philip either dies or abdicates or steps down. So Leticia, she'll be the next Queen of Spain. Pact of Forgiving that we mentioned when the government was established in the 1970s. A historic memory law was passed permitting investigation of Franco-era crimes and exhumation of bodies, and there's a lot of that been going on since. This was a socialist policy of the PSOE. Meanwhile, the king was having a fine old time living in Botswana with his girlfriend. She was a tour guide, I believe, German princess. And there he was, and it was really found out because he fell and broke his hip and had to come back for an operation. And that the news leaked out of where he'd been and what he'd been up to. In 2011, the election then was won back by the PP, and Rajoy became prime minister. And he had to deal with the fallout from the financial crash. A huge majority of the socialists were blamed for the crash, which was a bit unfair, really, because it wasn't exactly their fault. But you can see that the country was overwhelmingly PP in that particular election. Here's Rajoy. He had to try and get a bailout because Spain was pretty well broke. They joined the euro in 2001, and of course they couldn't devalue because they were now tied to the euro. In the past, with the peseta, of course, they would have devalued, and that would have improved the economy considerably. Because the economy in 2012 was in a bad way. It was boom to bust. The comunidades were overspent. Borrowing increased wildly, and they look for a bailout. And there was a huge amount of unemployment, particularly with young people. And I don't think really the position improved very much in the ensuing years. Perhaps in the coastal areas where you've got tourism, it's not so bad. Well, you did have tourism until last year, but in inland, I think unemployment is a big problem in Spain. They wanted a bailout. Valencia Comunidad wanted a bailout with huge debts. There's Valencia, of course, because they'd spent so much money on the Formula One, and the City of Arts and Sciences cost an enormous amount to maintain, let alone build in the first place. Fantastic buildings, but and the America's Cup, they built this huge marina in Valencia, which I believe is underused. So it's another extravagance, and of course the Castilian airport. So they went completely crazy spending money when they joined the euro and in the just before that. So they wanted a bailout, and of course the Germans are not so keen on bailing them out. 2014, we see the development of a new party, Podemos, meaning we can, and this is led. The sort of statements say, we do not want our young people to work serving tapas to rich Northern Europeans, look out. We do not want Spain to become a German colony. So this was the policy of Podemos, and they got a few votes. And you can see the independence parties at this time were polling 46% in Catalonia, not quite a majority. Iglesias, he was head of Podemos. He was well known on Spanish television, and this obviously helped to boost the fortunes of the Podemos party. In 2014, Juan Carlos abdicated in favor of his son, Felipe VI, and they were crowned in June 2014. Looking at the 2015 election, we now find that the two-party system is breaking up because Podemos got 69 seats and Ciudadanos, which is a sort of centrist anti-corruption party, they got 14 seats. So the system that they have in Spain, once you break off from the two-party system, you have to form coalitions, and the Spaniards don't seem to be very good at coalitions, and this leads to instability. And a similar election subsequently, we still got the same sort of situation, with Rajoy remaining prime minister, but on a minority. And he lost a confidence vote following a verdict, a corruption trial of PP officials in Madrid, so he stepped down, and Sanchez became PM of a minority government who supported Catalan nationalists, who are now threatening to withdraw if they don't support the government in Madrid. And his policy was to allow further devolution to Catalonia. In 2019, we have a position where the PSOE have the biggest number of seats, but they're not an overall majority. And we now see the appearance of this new party called Vox, which polled well in Andalusia, and they are a right of the PP. They're anti-immigration, they have family policies, centralizing power. They're not keen on the devolution, and they're keen on bullfighting and game hunting. So they're pretty right-wing lot. And they're doing particularly well, and they will tie in with the PP probably to form a right-wing government. Now, saying a little bit about Catalan independence. Catalonia has two flags. This is the Estrellada Blava flag, and there's another one called the Estrellada Vermella. They have two flags. Now, a little bit of history here. Of course, Spain until the 1460s was more than one country. It was Castile, the major part, and then Aragon on the east there. And this illustrates the situation where Granada, of course, was still under control of the Moors at that date, 1400. So they were separate kingdoms. And although Ferdinand, who was king of Aragon, and Isabel, who was queen of Castile, although they married and formed a shared monarchy, there were still independent governments in the two areas, Castile and Aragon. And it was only really in the War of Spanish Succession in the late 1600s that Aragon, at the end, unfortunately, supported the wrong side. They supported the Austrian claimants to the throne, where it was the French claimants, the Bourbons, that won in the end. And as a result of this, they lost their parliament and became incorporated and put under control of Madrid. And this has sort of been a basis for a resent going back all those number of years. Now, in 1931, when the Second Republic was established after the abdication of the monarchy, Alfonso XIII, they declared independence, but they were persuaded to become part of the Spanish Republic. And moving fast forward now, as I said, what a difficult time they had during the Franco period. And now they're making their presence felt again at the present time. And in that republic, in the Republic period in the 1930s, Louis Company, he was president of Catalonia, and he was very unfortunate because he escaped to France in 1939, but after the fall of France, he was captured by the Gestapo and he was sent back to Spain, and he was shot in 1940 by Franco's forces. But after the death of Franco, the king introduced this new constitution leading to devolution, as I've mentioned. And a new statute of autonomy for Catalonia was agreed by Zapatero, and with Zapatero and the PSOE always more considerate towards Catalonia's views than the PP are. So they gave us this statute of autonomy, but this agreement was challenged by the PP in the Spanish High Court, which ruled that it was unconstitutional because it referred to Catalonia as a state, and that was against the constitution of Spain. So it was turned down. And this set off a whole lot of demonstrations throughout Catalonia. And Catalonia economically is quite a powerhouse, 20% of GDP of Spain, and it's got 15% of the population, and the turnover is about the same as Portugal. So it's a very prosperous area, which is quite different, of course, to the situation in Scotland when we compare the situation regarding independence there. And of course, the thing is, though, once you start talking about independence, a lot of businesses will leave and settle somewhere else. And in fact, Caixa Bank, that I bank with, a bank that took over Barclays in Javea, brought out Barclays' Spanish interests. They moved their office from Barcelona to Valencia at this time to avoid any fallout from any Catalonia independence. So this is the sort of thing that soon happens. As soon as independence starts getting discussed and becomes a possibility, then a lot of businesses will reconsider and move on. So obviously the economy would suffer if Catalonia became truly independent. But as a result of these demonstrations, the Catalan president called a general election, which resulted in a majority for pro-independence parties. Parliament obeyed a Catalan sovereignty declaration asserting Catalan people had a right to decide their political future. He called for a referendum, which of course is unconstitutional under the Spanish constitution, and he got 80% favorable on a small turnout. But he was charged with running an illegal referendum and was barred from public life for 2 years and was fine. So he got off fairly lightly, but latterly, of course, they've suffered more. And they've had these huge rallies. This was in the Camp Nou in 2013 in favour of independence. Now we come on to this chap, Carles Puigdemont, who was head of the Generalitat of Catalonia and head of the Catalan European Democratic Party. And he called for a binding referendum in 2017. And this was interfered with by the Madrid government, who sent in police. And their article 155 in the constitution allowed central government to take over. State of emergency was declared. Members of the Catalonian government were arrested, and they called for fresh elections, and officials charged and put on trial. However, the election that they had still resulted in a majority for independence. Puigdemont flew to Belgium with several of his government. This amuses me a bit, because Madrid applied for a European arrest warrant, but apparently it wasn't properly drafted because it mentioned sedition, and that wasn't accepted as a European crime, and so he didn't have to get arrested, although there's some talk that he is going to get arrested shortly. Anyway, the government took over the government of Catalonia. And these three guys, these are the three who escaped. And I read recently that it looks as though their claims for immunity have been revoked by the European Parliament. And the lady on the right, I believe that she is a lecturer on Spanish history at a Scottish university. So they'll lose her if she gets arrested. But at the moment, I suppose she's still beavering away up in St Andrews, I think it is. Quim Torra, he was president of the Catalonia from May 2018 to September 2020. He's been forced to step down by the Supreme Court for disobeying electoral board during the 2019 election. And these who were in prison, these guys, were elected to the European Parliament, and they were given leave of absence to go and swear in and then come back to prison. So that was them. And the election results in Catalonia, again, showing just over a majority in favour of independence. Now, finally, there's this lady I have to mention, Isabel Díaz Ayunza. Now, she is the leader of the Madrid Comunidad, and she's leader of the PP in Madrid. And apparently their policy has been no lockdown, that the Madrileños can carry on as normal. And there was an election in 2021 and earlier this month, and the PP went up from 30 to 65 votes, 65 seats. So they did pretty well. And interestingly, Vox did as well. So Vox and PP between them will have a majority in the Madrid Comunidad Parliament. So that goes to show, if you have a policy against lockdown, you can probably do quite well politically. But whether they do that in the UK or not, goodness knows. So that was her policy. Their numbers are not good. Their cases are more than they are nationally, and there are more beds in hospitals with COVID patients. But even so, she won a lot of extra seats in the election earlier this month. Iglesias, who was leader of Podemos, you remember, he stepped down and decided to fight this regional election in Madrid. But Podemos did extremely badly, and they lost quite a lot of seats. So he's resigned from politics altogether. So I read. Right, so that brings us pretty well up to date. But being the U3A, of course, I've got a reading list for you. And I'll just say a few words about some of these books. This first one, The Seamstress, actually I bought it in the Stafford service station on the M6. And it's an interesting book. It's written by a lady, Duenas Maria, who is a member of the staff of Madrid University, and it tells the story of this lady who, with her mother, they made dresses for wealthy women, and they started off in Madrid, and then they go off to Spanish Morocco. She works in Tetuan, gets to know a lot of the aristocracy there and the diplomats and their wives. And subsequently, she goes back to Madrid during the Second World War, and she becomes a spy for the British Embassy. And it's really quite a good yarn. Nice read. And then Hooper's book is a definitive book really about Spain. I imagine there's a more recent edition of it now. That's the one I read, The New Spaniards. That's good. Paul Preston, of course, has written a lot of stuff about Spain, if you want to form a biography of Franco and Juan Carlos. And then finally, Sampson, who normally writes books about a medieval detective, but he also has this one book about life in Madrid in the early 1940s during the Second World War, and he describes how the British and American economic attaches in the embassies in Madrid control the amount of oil that Spain can import through from the Texaco company that had the contract to deliver oil. So make sure that Franco didn't get any fancy ideas about getting involved militarily in the Second World War. So that concludes my talk with the reading list, and I hope that is of interest to you all. Thank you very much.